Hey, we put in a lot of effort to bring this story to your ears. I know that after listening to this real story, you will go to sleep. So I have a small request. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and if possible, share it as well. This way, we can continue bringing you beautiful and true stories every day. Now let's move on to the story. The church was bathed in golden light as the late afternoon sun streamed through the towering stained glass windows. Rows of white chairs lined both sides of the grand aisle, each decorated with delicate roses and satin ribbons. The scent of fresh flowers mixed with the faint aroma of polished wooden pews, filling the air with a sense of warmth and celebration. Guests murmured among themselves, exchanging smiles and hushed whispers as the organist played a soft, melodic tune. Everything was set for the perfect wedding, a love story reaching its long-awaited climax. At the heart of it all stood Emma, the bride, a woman of quiet strength and grace. She stood behind the heavy church doors, her heart pounding against her chest. Dressed in an elegant white gown that shimmered with every movement, she clutched her bouquet tightly, trying to steady her breathing. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, yet an unshakable weight pressed against her chest. The past she had worked so hard to move on from still lingered, just beyond the reach of the vows she was about to take. Seated near the front, a little boy with tousled brown hair and big expressive eyes kicked his polished shoes against the floor. Daniel, just 6 years old, sat with his small hands gripping the hem of his neatly pressed suit. He had been told today was a happy occasion, yet something in his heart felt different. He looked up at his Grandma Rose, his mother's mother, who sat beside him with a gentle smile. She patted his hand, sensing the unease in her grandson's fidgeting. "It's going to be a beautiful day, sweetheart," she whispered, but Daniel only nodded, his eyes flickering toward the tall man at the altar. Michael, the groom, stood with quiet confidence, his hands clasped in front of him. He was a man of wealth, stability, and respect, a far cry from the man who had once left Emma heartbroken. He had promised her a fresh start, a love built on trust and security. Yet even as he smiled at the awaiting guests, his eyes scanned the room, seeking out the one pair of eyes that had yet to accept him. Daniel. Michael had tried for months to win over the boy, to make him see that he wasn't here to replace anyone. But the child had remained guarded, cautious. Michael could only hope that today would mark the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. As the heavy church doors creaked open, a hush fell over the crowd. Emma took her first step down the aisle, her heart hammering with every click of her heels against the marble floor. Daniel watched her, his small fingers clenching into fists. He didn't fully understand the weight of the moment, but something deep inside him whispered that everything was about to change, and he wasn't. Sure, he was ready for it. The soft hum of whispered conversations faded as Emma stepped into view. The golden light from the chandeliers cast a warm glow on her ivory gown, making her look almost ethereal. A collective sigh swept through the church as guests admired the stunning bride. Her dark curls framed her delicate face, and despite the nervous flutter in her chest, she carried herself with quiet grace. This was her moment, a second chance at love, and yet the tiny figure sitting in the front row held the power to unravel it all. Daniel sat still, his small fingers pressing into the folds of his suit pants. His wide brown eyes locked onto his mother as she walked down the aisle, each step bringing her closer to the man waiting at the altar. Something about it made his stomach twist. Everyone around him was smiling, whispering about how beautiful Emma looked, how lucky Michael was. But Daniel didn't feel lucky, he didn't feel happy, he felt unsure. Michael, standing tall and composed, exhaled slowly as he saw his bride approaching. His eyes softened as they met Emma's, his lips parting slightly, as if he were about to say something, but he held back. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. How he would smile, how he would gently take her hands, how he would promise to love her forever. Yet, in the corner of his vision, he caught sight of the little boy staring up at them with an expression that wasn't joy or excitement, but uncertainty. Emma's steps were measured, her fingers trembling against the bouquet of white roses. She could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, but none mattered more than the two pairs watching her from the front. One belonged to the man she was about to marry, the other to the little boy she had promised to protect above all else. She forced a smile as she met Michael's gaze, but something inside her felt unsettled. Grandma Rose noticed the flicker of hesitation in Emma's eyes. Seated beside Daniel, she reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Your mom is happy," she whispered, her voice calm and reassuring. "And Michael is a good man, sweetheart." Daniel swallowed, his fingers tightening around his grandmother's hand. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but his heart didn't understand why it felt like something was wrong. As Emma reached the altar, the priest stepped forward, a warm smile on his face. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the union of Emma Carter and Michael Lawson." The words echoed through the vast space, but Daniel barely heard them. His eyes darted between his mother and the man beside her. He tried to ignore the lump forming in his throat. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine. But deep down, a quiet voice inside him whispered a different truth. Emma handed her bouquet to her maid of honor and turned to Michael, her hands trembling slightly as he took them into his own. His touch was firm, reassuring. "You're beautiful," he whispered. She smiled, but the flicker of doubt remained in her eyes. The priest continued, "Marriage is a sacred bond, built on love, trust, and the promise to stand together in all seasons of life. Emma and Michael have chosen to embark on this journey, hand in hand, heart to heart." Daniel shifted in his seat, his chest feeling tight. He thought about the times his dad had held his mom's hand. He thought about how, once upon a time, his dad had made her smile too. And yet, he wasn't here. He had left. And now, his mom was standing beside someone new, promising forever all over again. The priest turned toward Michael. "Michael, do you take Emma to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and cherish her in sickness and in health for as long as you both shall live?" Michael's lips curled into a confident smile. "I do." The words echoed through the room, and a soft murmur of approval rippled through the guests. Emma exhaled, nodding slightly, as if convincing herself that this was right, that this was the life she was meant to have. The priest then turned to Emma. "Emma, do you take Michael to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish him in sickness and in health for as long as you both shall live?" Emma opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Daniel's voice broke through the silence. "Mommy, do you have to?" The words were quiet, yet powerful enough to bring everything to a sudden halt. A hush fell over the guests. The priest lowered his book slightly, eyebrows raised in surprise. Emma froze, her lips parting, her eyes locking onto Daniel's tear-filled gaze. Michael stiffened, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, some leaning in to murmur among themselves. The weight of Daniel's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She turned slowly, facing her son, her breath caught somewhere between confusion and heartbreak. Grandma Rose's face softened, her grip tightening around Daniel's tiny fingers. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, but Daniel wasn't looking at her anymore. His entire world was focused on his mother. Tears welled in his big brown eyes. His tiny hands trembled in his lap. His voice, though small, carried a weight no one in the room could ignore. "Mommy," he whispered again, his bottom lip quivering. "Do you have to marry him?" A stunned silence gripped the entire church. Emma's breath hitched. Every single person in the room was watching her now, waiting, expecting, and for the first time since this day had begun, she realized she didn't know how to answer. A heavy silence filled the church, thick like a dense fog. Every eye was fixed on the little boy, whose voice had just cut through the ceremony like a knife. Emma stood frozen at the altar, her hands trembling in Michael's grasp. She swallowed hard, trying to steady the storm rising in her chest. She had expected nerves, a few doubts maybe, but not this. Not her own son, questioning her in front of everyone. Daniel sat motionless, his small chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. His fingers gripped the fabric of his suit pants as he struggled to understand the flood of emotions crashing. Inside him, he wasn't trying to ruin anything. He wasn't even sure why he had spoken. But as he looked at his mother standing next to Michael, something about it didn't feel right. Michael inhaled slowly, pressing his lips together before glancing down at Daniel. The boy's face was red, his eyes wet, his tiny body stiff like he was fighting to hold back tears. Michael had seen that look before, the same look Daniel always had when he didn't trust someone, when he was afraid that something was about to change forever. The priest cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced between the bride, the groom, and the little boy in the front row. The guests, once murmuring with excitement, now sat in stunned silence. Even the soft hum of the church organ had faded into nothingness. Grandma. Rose turned to her grandson, her heart aching at the sight of his distress. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Daniel, sweetheart," she whispered, leaning closer. "What's wrong?" Daniel blinked, his tiny fists clenched. He didn't know how to explain it, not in the way grown-ups needed to hear. All he knew was that something about today, about seeing his mother in that white dress, about watching Michael stand in the place where his father once had, it made his chest feel tight. Emma finally found her voice, though it wavered as she crouched down slightly, meeting Daniel's gaze. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her eyes pleading. "Why would you ask that?" Daniel sniffed, his small shoulders rising and falling as he tried to find the words. "I don't want you to be sad again, Mommy," he whispered, barely loud. Enough for anyone to hear. A sharp pang shot through Emma's heart. She felt the weight of the past pressing down on her all over again. She had spent years picking up the broken pieces of herself after David, Daniel's father, had walked away. She had done everything to make sure her son never felt the pain of that loss as deeply as she had. But no matter how much she had tried to shield him, it was clear now. He had felt it all. Michael's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing at his sides. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He had spent months trying to connect with Daniel, trying to show him that he wasn't here to take his father's place, only to love both him and his mother in the way they deserved. But no matter what he did, Daniel had kept his distance. And now, standing in front of dozens of guests, the boy had spoken the one truth that Michael had feared the most. He wasn't ready for this. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it again. The pressure of 100 eyes staring at her made her head spin. She turned to the priest, who stood awkwardly, unsure of how to proceed. "Maybe we should take a moment," the priest suggested gently, offering her an out. Emma nodded, grateful for the pause. She turned back to Daniel, reaching out to him. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle. For a brief second, Daniel hesitated. Then with slow, careful steps, he slid off his seat and walked up the few steps to the altar. Emma knelt down, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Talk to me," she whispered. Daniel's lower lip trembled. He glanced at Michael, then back at his mother. His voice was small, fragile. "Are you sure he's going to make you happy, Mommy?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. Michael stiffened, his heart sinking. The room was so quiet it felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emma blinked rapidly, fighting the sting of tears in her eyes. She placed a hand over Daniel's cheek, her thumb stroking gently. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't sure." Daniel's gaze searched hers, looking for an answer he wasn't sure he could find. "But what if he leaves?" "Two!" A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the audience. Emma felt like she had been struck by lightning. Michael's breath hitched, and for the first time, the confident groom felt utterly speechless. Grandma Rose covered her mouth, her heart breaking for the little boy who had carried so much fear inside him. The words hung in the air like a thundercloud about to break. Daniel had spoken the truth no one wanted to acknowledge, the truth that still haunted Emma, the truth that made Michael realize he had a much bigger challenge ahead than just marrying the woman he loved. And at that moment, as Emma held her son close, she knew this wasn't just about her happiness. It was about Daniel's too. The church was still. No one dared to move, no one dared to whisper. The only sound was the faint, shaky breathing of Daniel, standing there in his tiny suit, his little fingers curled into fists at his sides. His question echoed in the vast space of the church, lingering in the air like a delicate thread, ready to snap. Emma, kneeling before him, could feel her heart pounding. She had spent years building a life where she and her son could be safe, where they could move forward without the pain of the past looming over them. And yet, in this very moment, she could see it. Daniel had been carrying that pain all along. Her hands trembled as she brushed his cheek, offering him a reassuring smile despite the lump forming in her throat. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice almost breaking, "I promise you, Michael is not going anywhere." Daniel looked at her, searching her face for the truth. But trust was not something easily given by a child who had already learned what loss felt like. Michael shifted on his feet, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had always known that winning over Emma's heart was only half the battle. Convincing her son that he was here to stay was the real test. He took a slow step forward, lowering himself to Daniel's height. "I know you're scared," Michael said softly, keeping his voice calm. "I would be too, but I need you to believe me when I say I'm not leaving. I love your mother, and I want to be here for both of you, always." Daniel's lip quivered, his tiny fingers rubbing together. Nervously, his eyes darted between his mother and Michael, uncertainty swirling in his little heart. From the pews, Grandma Rose watched the exchange with sad but knowing eyes. She had seen this before, in Emma, when she had been just a little girl, afraid of losing what she loved most. The guests remained silent, watching, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. The priest, caught in the middle of the unexpected moment, hesitated before slowly closing his book, giving them time. Emma swallowed hard. "Daniel, sweetheart, is there something else? Something you want to tell me?" For a second, Daniel's tiny shoulders tensed, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. He glanced at Michael again, then back at his mother, and then he whispered something that sent a ripple of shock through the room. "What if my daddy comes back?" The air seemed to vanish from Emma's lungs. A hush fell over the church, thick and unshakable. Michael's entire body stiffened. Grandma Rose closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a slow, measured breath. Emma's heart clenched painfully in her chest. She hadn't heard that name spoken by her son in so long. David, Daniel's father, the man who had once been her everything and had shattered her world when he walked away. Tears burned in the back of Emma's eyes as she reached for Daniel's hands, her voice trembling. "Oh, sweetheart, we've talked about this before. But what if he comes back?" Daniel asked again, his voice louder this time. His little hands were shaking now, his face flushed. "What if he wants us again? What if he—" His voice cracked, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. "What if he loves us again?" A soft gasp escaped from somewhere in the crowd. Emma felt like her heart had been ripped open. She had spent years convincing herself that she had moved on, that she had healed, that she had done everything in her power to make sure Daniel knew he was loved, even without his father in the picture. But standing here, looking into her son's tearful eyes, she realized something painful. He had never stopped waiting. The weight of that realization crushed her. Michael clenched his jaw, exhaling sharply as he ran a hand through his neatly styled hair. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but this was worse than anything he had expected. Grandma Rose finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Daniel, sweetheart, your daddy made a choice a long time ago, and I know it hurt, but your mommy has done everything to keep you safe and happy. Michael, she paused, glancing at the man beside Emma. Michael is here because he loves you both. He's not trying to take your daddy's place. He's just trying to be here for you, Daniel sniffed, rubbing his eyes with his tiny fists. But I don't want to forget my daddy. Emma reached out, gently wiping the tears from his cheeks. Oh, my love, you never have to forget him, she whispered, but you have to understand. Sometimes people leave, and we don't get to choose if they come back. Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to stay strong for her son. But I promise you, you will always have me, and you will always be loved. Michael inhaled deeply, stepping closer. And I promise you, Daniel, he said, his voice steady, sincere, I'm here because I choose to be. I'm not going anywhere. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, his little chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. His mind swirled, with confusion, with emotions too big for his small heart to understand. Emma waited, feeling like the world had slowed down around them. Emma, kneeling before him, could feel her heart pounding. She had spent years building a life where she and her son could be safe, where they could move forward without the pain of the past looming over them. And yet, in this very moment, she could see it. Daniel had been carrying that pain all along. Her hands trembled as she brushed his cheek, offering him a reassuring smile despite the lump forming in her throat. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice almost breaking, "I promise you, Michael is not going anywhere." Daniel looked at her, searching her face for the truth. But trust was not something easily given by a child who had already learned what loss felt like. Michael shifted on his feet, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had always known that winning over Emma's heart was only half the battle. Convincing her son that he was here to stay was the real test. He took a slow step forward, lowering himself to Daniel's height. "I know you're scared," Michael said softly, keeping his voice calm. "I would be too, but I need you to believe me when I say I'm not leaving. I love your mother, and I want to be here for both of you, always." Daniel's lip quivered, his tiny fingers rubbing together nervously. His eyes darted between his mother and Michael, uncertainty swirling in his little heart. From the pews, Grandma Rose watched the exchange with sad but knowing eyes. She had seen this before, in Emma, when she had been just a little girl, afraid of losing what she loved most. The guests remained silent, watching, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. The priest, caught in the middle of the unexpected moment, hesitated before slowly closing his book, giving them time. Emma swallowed hard. "Daniel, sweetheart, is there something else? Something you want to tell me?" For a second, Daniel's tiny shoulders tensed, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. He glanced at Michael again, then back at his mother. And then he whispered something that sent a ripple of shock through the room. "What if my daddy comes back?" The air seemed to vanish from Emma's lungs. A hush fell over the church, thick and unshakable. Michael's entire body stiffened. Grandma Rose closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a slow, measured breath. Emma's heart clenched painfully in her chest. She hadn't heard that name spoken by her son in so long. David, Daniel's father, the man who had once been her everything and had shattered her world when he walked away. Tears burned in the back of Emma's eyes as she reached for Daniel's hands, her voice trembling. "Oh, sweetheart, we've talked about this before. But what if he comes back?" Daniel asked again, his voice louder this time. His little hands were shaking now, his face flushed. "What if he wants us again? What if he—" His voice cracked, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. "What if he loves us again?" A soft gasp escaped from somewhere in the crowd. Emma felt like her heart had been ripped open. She had spent years convincing herself that she had moved on, that she had healed, that she had done everything in her power to make sure Daniel knew he was loved, even without his father in the picture. But standing here, looking into her son's tearful eyes, she realized something painful. He had never stopped waiting. The weight of that realization crushed her. Michael clenched his jaw, exhaling sharply as he ran a hand through his neatly styled hair. He had known this wouldn't be easy, But this was worse than anything he had expected. Grandma Rose finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Daniel, sweetheart, your daddy made a choice a long time ago, and I know it hurt, but your mommy has done everything to keep you safe and happy. Michael," she paused, glancing at the man beside Emma. "Michael is here because he loves you both. He's not trying to take your daddy's place. He's just trying to be here for you." Daniel sniffed, rubbing his eyes with his tiny fists. "But I don't want to forget my daddy." Emma reached out, gently wiping the tears from his cheeks. "Oh, my love, you never have to forget him," she whispered. "But you have to understand. Sometimes people leave, and we don't get to choose if they come back." Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to stay strong for her son. "But I promise you, you will always have me, and you will always be loved." Michael inhaled deeply, stepping closer. "And I promise you, Daniel," he said, his voice steady, sincere, "I'm here because I choose to be. I'm not going anywhere." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, his little chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. His mind swirled, with confusion, with emotions too big for his small heart to understand. Emma waited, feeling like the world had slowed down around them. Outside, the air was crisp and sharp against Emma's flushed cheeks. She stood near the stone steps of the church, her hands gripping the railing, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. She hadn't wanted to run. She had promised herself she wouldn't let her past control her. But standing there, in that church, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. Fear that Daniel was right. Fear that Michael, no matter how kind, no matter how loving, would one day leave, just like David had. A soft shuffle of footsteps pulled her out of her thoughts. Emma. She stiffened but didn't turn around. She knew that voice, knew the warmth in it, the patience, the silent strength. Michael stepped beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't speak right away, didn't try to push her for answers. He simply waited, letting the quiet settle between them. Emma swallowed hard, blinking away, the tears that threatened to spill. "I don't know if I can do this," she finally whispered. Michael's jaw tensed, but he nodded slowly. "Because of Daniel," she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Because of me." Michael turned fully, toward her now, his gaze gentle but unwavering. "Emma," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You're not her anymore. You're not the woman who was left behind. You're not the woman who had to pick up the pieces alone." Emma clenched her hands into fists. "But what if I still feel like I am?" Her voice broke, her body trembling. "What if I don't know how to be anything else?" Michael took a slow step closer. "Then let me remind you." Emma finally looked at him, and for the first time she let herself see him, not as the man she was supposed to marry, not as the person who had been patient and kind and unwavering, but as the man who had chosen to love her, despite everything, and that terrified her. She let out a shaky breath. "I don't want to hurt you," Michael smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Then don't." Emma looked away, guilt and love warring inside her. "Daniel," she whispered, shaking her head, "he still misses his father. No matter how much I want to believe we're ready for this, I can't ignore that." Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I know." Emma's lip trembled. "And what if I'm wrong about you?" Michael didn't flinch. He didn't look offended. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he reached for her hand, gently lacing his fingers through hers. "Then I'll prove you wrong." Emma closed her eyes, her heart twisting painfully. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she deserved this, that happiness wasn't something that could be stolen from her again. But fear was a cruel thing, and as much as she loved Michael, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to let him love her back. Inside the church, Daniel sat quietly, his hands clasped in his lap. His mind raced, his little heart aching with the weight of emotions he didn't know how to name. He didn't mean to ruin anything. He didn't mean to make his mommy cry. He just wanted to know she was safe. Grandma Rose leaned down, kissing the top of his head. "You're a brave boy, Daniel," she whispered, "brave and kind, and no matter what happens, your mommy will always love you." Daniel sniffled, nodding. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about love, it was about trust. And as much as he wanted to believe in Michael's promises, there was still a tiny part of him that wasn't ready to, because once upon a time, someone else had made promises, too, and they had broken every single one of them. Michael turned back toward the church doors, running a tired hand down his face. He knew that when they walked back inside, nothing would be the same. The ceremony was no longer just about a wedding, it was about a choice that only Emma could make, and no matter how much he loved her, no matter how much he wanted to be the man she and Daniel needed, he knew one thing for certain: she had to choose him for herself, or not at all. Michael stood at the church doors, his fingers gripping the cool brass handle. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He had walked into this day prepared for vows, for promises, for a future that he had long envisioned with Emma and Daniel. But now, as he looked toward the side of the church where Emma had retreated, he knew this was not a moment that could be fixed with a few whispered reassurances. She had to decide for herself, for Daniel, and for him. Michael had always known that loving Emma meant loving every broken piece of her past, accepting the fears she carried, the shadows that followed her. He had never expected it to be easy, but standing here now, facing the reality of it, he realized how deep those wounds still ran. Inside the church, Daniel sat quietly beside Grandma Rose, his little hands pressed together in his lap. His heart felt heavy, like it was holding a weight far too big for him to carry. He kept glancing at the church doors, waiting, hoping. Was his mother coming back? Michael exhaled, finally turning away from the doors. His gaze swept over the crowd, guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, whispering behind their hands, watching him like he was the last piece holding this moment together. He wasn't. That piece belonged to Emma. He took slow, measured steps back toward the altar, his mind racing. When he reached the front, he turned toward the priest, then toward the guests. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable sadness in it. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, forcing a small smile. "I know this isn't how any of us expected this moment to unfold, but the truth is, marriage isn't just about saying "I do" in front of a room full of people. It's about choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." A few guests nodded, some exchanging understanding glances. Michael glanced over at Daniel. The boy's wide eyes were locked onto him, waiting, unsure. Michael turned back to the room. "Emma needs time, and I'd rather wait forever for her to be sure than rush into something she's not ready for." He let out a slow breath. "So, if she comes back through those doors, then I'll be right here. But if she doesn't, then that's a choice I'll respect." A hush fell over the room. The guests had expected an explanation, maybe even an apology for the delay. But this was something more. It was a man laying down his pride, choosing love over expectation. Daniel's fingers tightened around the fabric of his suit. Something about the way Michael spoke, something about how he didn't sound angry, didn't sound like he was blaming anyone, made his little heart ache in a way he didn't quite understand. Michael slowly turned, walking back down the aisle. He didn't leave, but he didn't stand at the altar anymore either. Instead, he took a seat near the front row, placing his hands on his knees, waiting for Emma to decide. Emma stood just outside the church, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her face. She had heard every word Michael had said. The way he hadn't begged, hadn't demanded. He had simply waited. Her heart twisted painfully. He was giving her the choice. For so long, Emma had felt like life had never really given her a choice. David had walked away. She had been left to raise Daniel alone. She had fought to rebuild herself, to create something steady, something safe. And when Michael had come into her life, he had been everything she had convinced herself she didn't. Need patient, kind, willing to stay. But that was the problem, wasn't it? She had spent so many years surviving that she had never really let herself believe in staying. And now, her son was afraid, because all he had ever known was loss. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight. She closed her eyes. inhaling sharply. Was she really going to walk away from this? From him? Or was she finally going to fight for the love she deserved? Inside, Daniel sat on the edge of his seat, his little legs swinging anxiously. His fingers fidgeted in his lap, his heart pounding as he kept looking at the doors. A full minute passed, then another. Michael sat still, his hands folded together, his expression unreadable. But inside, his chest felt like it was constricting, with every second that ticked by. And then the doors creaked open, a sharp intake of breath swept through the guests. Heads turned, murmurs rose. Emma stood in the doorway, her dark curls slightly tousled from the wind outside, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glistening. She took a slow step forward, then another. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his fingers digging. Into his suit, Emma's gaze swept across the church, locking onto Michael's almost instantly. And in that moment, she knew he was still waiting for her, for Daniel, for whatever choice she made. Her chest tightened. She had spent so long being afraid of losing everything again that she had never considered what would happen if she chose to stay. And so she took a breath, and she walked forward, step by step, slow, steady, until she was standing right in front of him. A tear slipped down Daniel's cheek, but this time it wasn't from sadness. Michael looked up at Emma, his hands resting in his lap. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Emma exhaled a soft, shaky laugh. "No," she admitted, "but I know one thing for sure." Michael tilted his head slightly, waiting. Emma reached for Daniel's hand, pulling him close, letting him tuck himself against her side. She pressed a kiss to his forehead before looking at Michael again, her eyes soft but determined. "I don't want to keep running," she whispered. Michael's lips parted slightly. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders finally relaxing. "You sure?" Emma nodded, gripping Daniel's hand tighter. "I'm sure." Michael stood slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. He searched her face, making sure there was no hesitation, no lingering doubt. And when he saw nothing but quiet certainty, he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head in relief. The priest, having watched the exchange in silence, finally stepped forward with a knowing smile. "Shall we begin again?" Emma turned to Daniel. "Is that okay with you, sweetheart?" Daniel sniffled but nodded, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Yeah," he whispered. "Just don't forget me, okay?" Emma crouched down, cupping his little face in her hands. "Never," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "You're my whole world." Michael knelt beside them, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "And if you let me, I'd really like to be a part of that world too." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He didn't say anything, but when he reached out and took Michael's hand in his own, the message was clear. Michael smiled. "Okay then," Emma laughed softly, shaking her head. "Okay then," she echoed. The priest cleared his throat. "Well then, let's try this one more time." And this time, as Emma stood beside Michael, Daniel standing between them, she knew she wasn't walking into this alone. She never would be again. The church was silent once more, but this time it was filled with warmth, not tension. Emma stood at the altar, Daniel nestled between her and Michael, his tiny fingers still wrapped around Michael's hand. There was no hesitation now, no lingering doubt, only the quiet, fragile acceptance that they were stepping into something new. The priest smiled gently as he continued where he had left off. "Marriage is not just the union of two people, but of two hearts, two lives, and in this case a family that chooses each other." Emma squeezed Daniel's hand, glancing down at him. He looked up at her, his brown eyes still wary, but softer. Now, she gave him a reassuring smile, and he leaned into her side, as if finally allowing himself to believe that she wasn't going anywhere. Michael, standing tall beside them, exhaled deeply. He had waited for this moment, fought for it in ways he never imagined he would have to, and now, standing here, watching Emma and Daniel slowly let him in, he knew it was worth every second. But just as the priest prepared to move forward, a sudden sound echoed through the church. The heavy wooden doors creaked open once more. Heads turned. A murmur of confusion rippled through the guests. Emma's breath hitched as she instinctively tightened her grip on Daniel, and then a man stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and an expression that sent a cold shiver down Emma's spine. David. Gasps erupted throughout the church. Grandma Rose stiffened, her hands gripping the arms of the pew. Michael's jaw tightened, his entire body tensing at the sight of the man he had only heard about in whispered conversations and painful memories. Daniel's little body went rigid. Emma felt like she had forgotten how to breathe. The man who had once held her heart, the man who had walked away without looking back, was standing at the entrance of her new beginning, and he wasn't invited. A thick silence fell over the room, broken only by the slow, measured sound of David's footsteps as he walked down the aisle, his gaze locked on the small boy standing beside his mother. Daniel's fingers twitched, his grip on Michael's hand loosening slightly. His lips parted, but no words came out. Michael's muscles coiled, his protective instincts kicking in immediately. He took a subtle step forward, instinctively positioning himself between Emma and David, a silent but clear message: you don't get to walk in here and pretend you belong. Emma finally found her voice, though it came out in a whisper. David, what are you doing here? David stopped a few feet away, his eyes flickering between her and Daniel. I had to come, he said simply, his voice rougher than she remembered. I needed to see my son. Emma's breath caught. The audacity of those words sent a wave of anger crashing through her, but before she could respond, Daniel did something that made her heart stop. He took a step forward. Emma reached for him instinctively but hesitated. Daniel looked up at the man before him, his little brows furrowed, his hands curling into fists. He was 6 years old, but at this moment he carried the weight of something far beyond his years. You left, Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. You never came back. David swallowed, shifting slightly on his feet. I know, he admitted, his gaze lowering, and I don't expect you to understand why, but I'm here now. Daniel's small chest rose and fell rapidly, his emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. He looked at his mother, then at Michael, then back at the man who had once been his father. Michael's hands curled at his sides, but he stayed silent. Waiting, Emma stepped closer to her son, resting a hand gently on his back. Daniel, sweetheart, you don't have to say anything you don't want to. Daniel's fingers twitched. He looked at David again, his little face a storm of emotions. Why now? He finally asked. Why today? David hesitated. I heard about the wedding. He glanced at Michael, something unreadable passing through his expression. I guess I realized too late that I had no right to stay away, but I didn't want to let you go without at least seeing you. Emma felt her stomach turn. She had spent years wondering if this moment would ever come, if David would suddenly reappear, asking for forgiveness. She had rehearsed every possible response, every version of what she would say to him. But now that he was standing here, she felt nothing except a cold certainty. He had no place in this moment. Daniel's fingers gripped the fabric of Emma's dress. His voice wavered, but it held strength that made her proud. You don't get to just come back and be my daddy again. David flinched slightly, his expression flickering with something like regret. Emma crouched beside her son, brushing a curl from his forehead. Daniel, she murmured, what do you want? Daniel hesitated, then looked at Michael. For a long moment, he just stared, as if searching for something in the man who had been by his side through everything, and then he reached out and took Michael's hand again. Emma's throat tightened. Daniel turned back to David. I already have. Someone who stayed. A stunned silence filled the church. David opened his mouth, but no words came. Michael, still composed, finally spoke. Daniel doesn't owe you anything, he said, his voice calm but firm. Neither does Emma. You made a choice, David. And they made theirs. David's eyes flickered between them, realizations settling over him. He had come here expecting something. Acceptance, forgiveness, maybe even a place in the family he had abandoned. But what he found instead was a love that had already healed without him. Emma straightened, her hand resting protectively on Daniel's shoulder. "I think you should go." David swallowed, looking down at his son one last time. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay." And just like that, he turned and walked away. The doors shut behind him with a soft thud. A weight lifted from Emma's chest. She looked down at Daniel, brushing a tear from his cheek. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Daniel sniffled, but nodded. He looked up at Michael, then back at his mother. "I just want to go home." Emma smiled softly. "Me too, baby." Michael knelt down, resting a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You did good, buddy." Daniel didn't say anything, but for the first time, he let himself lean against Michael, trusting. Emma reached for Michael's hand, squeezing it tightly. The priest, who had been silent through it all, exhaled and smiled. "Well," he said lightly, "shall we finish this wedding?" Emma let out a watery laugh, nodding. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we shall." And this time, as they stood at the altar, there were no doubts, no interruptions, only a promise that would never be broken. The air in the church was lighter now, as if a storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet calm. David was gone, his presence nothing more than a shadow that had briefly interrupted their moment, but it no longer held power over them. Emma stood at the altar once more, her hand resting on Daniel's small shoulder, her other hand still wrapped in Michael's warm grasp. The weight in her chest had lifted. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. The priest, who had been patiently observing, cleared his throat gently. "Shall we continue?" Emma looked down at Daniel. His little face was still damp from tears, but his small fingers were wrapped around Michael's with an ease that hadn't been there before. He looked up at his mother, searching her face as if silently asking if she was really, truly okay. She gave him a reassuring nod. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yeah." Emma turned back to Michael, her chest tightening at the depth of love she saw in his eyes. He had waited for her. He had given her space, had let her battle her fears without ever pressuring her, and now, when it mattered the most, he had chosen to stay. The priest smiled warmly and picked up where he had left off. Marriage is not just the joining of two souls, but the promise to stand by each other no matter what comes. His gaze flickered to Daniel before returning to Emma and Michael. "It is also about family, the one you are born into, and the one you choose to build." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat, blinking rapidly against the emotions swelling. Inside her, Michael's fingers brushed against hers, steady and sure. The priest turned to Michael first. "Michael, do you take Emma to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and cherish her, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Michael didn't hesitate. "I do." His voice was firm, unwavering. A soft smile touched Emma's lips. The priest turned to her. "Emma, do you want Michael to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish him, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked at Daniel, at the little boy who had been her whole world for so long, and she saw something new in his eyes, not fear, not doubt, but trust. And for the first time she knew they were ready for this. She turned back to Michael, her heart full. "I do." A wave of warmth washed over her as Michael's lips curled into a smile, his relief evident. The priest nodded, his own expression filled with quiet joy. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled at Michael. "You may kiss the bride." Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head as he leaned in. "Finally." Emma laughed, tilting her face up to meet him, their lips brushing together in a kiss that wasn't just about love, but about choosing each other. A cheer erupted from the guests, applause filling the church. Grandma Rose dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her heart swelling with pride. But the most important moment came when Emma pulled back, turned to Daniel, and crouched down in front of him. "Come here, sweetheart," she whispered, opening her arms. Daniel hesitated for only a second before launching himself into her embrace. She held him close, pressing a kiss into his soft curls. "I love you, baby," she murmured, "more than anything." Daniel sniffled but buried his face in her shoulder, his tiny arms wrapping around her neck. "I love you too, Mommy." Michael crouched beside them, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's. "You're back. How about me, buddy?" he teased lightly. Daniel pulled back slightly, his little face serious. He studied Michael for a moment, then, without a word, wrapped his small arms around his new stepfather's neck. Michael froze, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. Then slowly he returned the hug, his hands firm but gentle against the boy's small frame. "Thank you," Daniel whispered. Michael's throat tightened. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting himself feel the weight of what this meant. "Any time, kiddo." The guests, watching the scene unfold, were silent for a moment, moved by the rawness of it all. Then someone started clapping, then another, and before they knew it, the entire church was filled with the sound of cheers, laughter, and celebration. The past was behind them now, and the future. It was theirs to build. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the wedding reception buzzed with joy and laughter. The air was filled with the sound of clinking glasses, the rustle of dancing feet against polished floors, and the soft murmur of conversations weaving together like threads of a beautiful tapestry. Emma sat at a small table near the center of the room, watching as Daniel ran around with a few other children, his laughter bright and free. Michael slid into the seat beside her, his hand finding hers under the table. "He looks happy." Emma nodded, a soft smile gracing her lips. "He does." Michael squeezed her fingers. "And you?" Emma turned to him, searching his face. "I am." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. "Good." She rested her head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of the moment settle over her. For so long she had feared love, feared that it was something that could be stolen, something that could vanish without warning. But now, as she sat there, with her husband beside her and her son playing nearby, she realized the truth. Love wasn't something fragile, it was something they built. Together, Daniel ran up to them, his cheeks flushed from playing, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Can we have cake now?" Emma laughed, ruffling his hair. "Yes, baby. Let's have cake." Michael chuckled, scooping Daniel up effortlessly in his arms. "I like the way you think, buddy." Daniel giggled, wrapping his arms around Michael's neck. "You're okay," he declared. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Just okay?" Daniel grinned. "Maybe a little better than okay." Emma laughed as she followed them toward the dessert table, her heart light. Tonight was just the beginning, and for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't afraid of the future, because they were walking into it together. The wedding had been beautiful, filled with laughter, tears, and moments that none of them would ever forget. The reception hall was still buzzing with warmth as guests clinked their glasses. Music played softly in the background, and laughter echoed through the space. Emma sat at a table, her heart full, as she watched Daniel dart between guests. His little face lit up with a joy she hadn't seen in years. He had been through so much today, so many emotions, so many questions, but in the end, he had chosen love. And that choice had been entirely his own. A gentle hand rested on hers, and she turned to see Michael watching her, his blue eyes warm with quiet understanding. "You okay?" he asked softly. Emma exhaled, smiling. "Yeah, I think I really am." Michael chuckled, running his thumb over her knuckles. "That's good to hear." She glanced back at Daniel, who was now laughing with Grandma Rose, his small hands waving animatedly as he told her something with excitement. Emma's throat tightened at the sight. "You know," she murmured, "I was scared for so long that I'd never get to see him this happy again." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "He's a strong kid, just like his mom." Emma let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know about that." Michael leaned in, brushing a kiss against her temple. "I do." She closed her eyes. For a brief moment, letting the warmth of the moment settle deep in her bones. For so long, she had carried the weight of the past, the fear that history would repeat itself, But now, sitting here surrounded by love, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that changed everything. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, Emma found herself standing outside beneath a sky full of stars. The cool night air wrapped around her, gentle and calm. A soft shuffle of footsteps made her turn. Daniel stood a few feet away, his little hands tucked into the pockets of his suit. His face was serious, thoughtful, the way it always was when something big was on his mind. Emma smiled, crouching down. "What's on your mind, baby?" Daniel hesitated before stepping closer, his small fingers reaching for hers. "Are we gonna be okay?" he asked softly. Emma's heart ached at the question, but she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be okay." Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding, as if deciding to believe her. Then, in the quietest voice, he whispered, "I think I like Michael." Emma let out a soft breath, her eyes misting over. "Yeah?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, he stayed." Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat and pulled her son into her arms. "He did," she whispered against his soft curls. "And so did we." Daniel's little arms tightened around her. For the first time in a long time, they were home. And this time, it was built on love that would never leave. Thanks for listening to the story. If you've been through something similar, share your experience in the comments. Let's support each other. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to watch the story, a little girl saved a rich businessman from an accident. What he did next, shocked. Click on right. If you want to watch the story, how she was kicked out of her own wedding, but when she returned 5 years later, click on left.